Good day, everyone. My name is Christopher Hart, and it's a privilege and an honor for me to be asked to participate in this panel with Scott Shackelford on the case for a National Cybersecurity Safety Board. Scott is the cyber expert. I'm a former chairman of the NTSB, so I'm the safety board expert. So we'll present together. Scott is going to start and talk about the cybersecurity aspects, then I'll take over with the NTSB aspects. So enjoy the conference, and afterward, I understand we have Q&A for people to ask questions, so we look forward to that as well. And meanwhile, let me turn it over to Scott. Scott?
Thank you so much, Chris, and greetings, everyone. As Chris said, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you, at least virtually, to discuss a very timely topic that's even gotten more so recently. That is the creation of a National Cybersecurity Safety Board modeled after the NTSB. Before we dive into the particulars, though, including the recent Biden administration executive order setting up a cyber safety review board, we thought just a bit of context may be helpful, particularly for the uninitiated. First, it's important to note that the topic we'll be speaking on today, the National Cyber Safety Board, is, of course, just a small part of a much bigger conversation on how we should go about protecting not only the nation's, but the world's vulnerable critical infrastructure. As many of you are doubtless aware, this is a topic very much in the eye of the beholder. Here in the U.S., we have 16 critical infrastructure sectors as designated by our Department of Homeland Security, whereas in the EU, there are 7 critical infrastructure sectors recognized under the Network Information Security Directive there. So even at the starting gates, we're coming from different starting points, which, as we'll see, is very different than is the case in the aviation context with the NTSB. Though, as a quick aside, we have seen some progress recently through the various cyber norms building efforts through the UN to come to a more common understanding about what we mean by critical infrastructure, including with regards to elections. This does beg the question, though, especially here in the States, given our broad perspective on critical infrastructure, now that the majority of our economy has been designated as critical, if everything is critical, then is anything at the end of the day. And even more importantly, how can we best coordinate our expertise and resources to defend vulnerable critical infrastructure against the huge array of cyber-enabled threats, including ransomware that we've seen recently? Indeed, cyber threats to critical infrastructure are not a new problem, despite the fact that they're constantly in the news these days, such as the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline, or even in the agricultural sector, as we saw with Brazil-based JBS. There are varying estimates for when this story really got going. One common date that always gets some attention is November 2nd, 1988, which is, of course, the date of the Morris worm, when Roger Morris, who was a Cornell grad student at the time, wound up infecting MIT's networks, which, of course, then spread into what became one of the world's first DDoS attacks. Of course, Roger felt really sorry in the aftermath, sent a note of apology. Interesting, the dark side also tried to send that note of apology after Colonial Pipeline recently. But, things didn't work out too poorly for Roger at the end of the day, despite being prosecuted under the then pretty recent Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. This is a relevant episode to keep in mind because in the aftermath of the Morris worm, we saw the creation of the world's first cyber emergency response team, or CERT, based at Carnegie Mellon. And indeed, right around that same time, the first report, as we'll mention in a moment in more detail, came out that called for the creation, believe it or not, of an NTSB-like organization to help promote cybersecurity, particularly for critical infrastructure. Now, these days, of course, the stakes could not be higher in this context, given the huge proliferation of cyber attacks in terms of numbers, sophistication, and severity, the fact that they're targeting companies and countries alike, both critical and non-critical infrastructure providers. And of course, the attack surface as well continues to grow exponentially with the rapidly expanding Internet of Things. To give you an idea of one state-level snapshot for how this is playing out, we were asked by the Indiana Executive Council on Cybersecurity this last year to put together a report for how both critical and non-critical infrastructure providers were faring, given this huge array of cyber-enabled threats that they're facing. And it's a classic good news, bad news story. We found, for example, that more than 95% of the respondents to this survey, which went out across the state to small, medium-sized businesses, local governments, we had hundreds of responses, 95% were either somewhat or very concerned about cyber attacks. And indeed, there were a lot of follow-up to that concern, as we'll see in just a moment. But unfortunately, it was not always enough. Many, the majority even, had experienced cyber attacks in the last 3 years. 28%, though, of non-critical infrastructure providers experienced those cyber attacks, whereas only 13% of critical infrastructure providers did, though, which is interesting and goes to show that there could be some benefits with being classified in a critical infrastructure sector in terms of information sharing and different cybersecurity best practices and resources that they could have access to. One other quick finding that we thought was interesting, 91% of these survey respondents reported taking these proactive steps that I mentioned a moment ago. Now, these really ran the gambit in terms of new antivirus, new anti-malware software that was being installed, updating perhaps an incident response plan, purchasing cyber risk insurance. More than half of our respondents had already had a cyber risk insurance policy, with another 20% reporting that they were actively considering such a purchase. Though we found a huge amount of confusion over what was in these policies, including with regards to the exclusions, which has gotten so much attention lately, especially the hostile acts and warlike acts exclusions, which have been such a big deal in nation-state sponsored cyber attacks. And again, 94% of these critical infrastructure organizations reported taking those proactive steps versus 88%. So not as big of a difference there, but still a bit of a difference worth noting. So as we can see, we have made some progress with regards to identifying, conceptualizing this cyber-enabled threat to critical infrastructure and how we define that key term. But clearly, there's a long way to go. We've had a series of exercises over the years that have been designed to better protect the nation in this space. Those really date back quite a long time at this point, more than 20 years, to Presidential Decision Directive 63 way back in 1999, which established this sector-specific approach to cybersecurity and the birth of these ISACs, these information sharing and analysis centers tasked to each one. But, clearly, that was not enough. During the Obama administration, there was a big push to establish DHS as the focal point for protecting critical infrastructure. There was a bill back in 2012 that would have given DHS responsibility to not only define critical infrastructure sectors, but to set cybersecurity benchmarks, along with a safe harbor to help incentivize companies to meet those benchmarks. But that was filibustered and didn't go anywhere, which was the big reason we got the NIST cybersecurity framework, which has done a lot to help define and establish cybersecurity due diligence in both the critical infrastructure and non-critical infrastructure context. But as we've seen with SolarWinds, the various supply chain attacks recently, this is only a data point and more needs to be done, which is one reason that we think it could be time for this National Cybersecurity Safety Board. Now, again, this is not a new concept. The idea has been around for more than 30 years at this point. Again, shortly after the Morris worm, we had this 1991 report, Computers at Risk, which explicitly called for the creation of a National Cybersecurity Safety Board, or an analog to it. 2014, there was another NSF report that made a similar case. Lately, we've seen proponents, including Alex Stamos and Senator Mark Warner, come out in support of this concept, as well as a brand new hot off the presses report from the Belfer Center that both Chris and I were involved with, learning from cyber incidents, that takes a deep dive in this topic and was organized by Rob Kanacki and Adam Shostak. And we'll give a few insights, a few takeaways from this report, though it's still in draft form at the time we recorded this. So we have to take some of those with a grain of salt. And of course, all this is leading up to the brand new executive order that establishes this Cyber Safety Review Board. So a few highlights from this order, given the limited time that we have. As you see here, Section 5 in particular establishes this Cyber Safety Review Board, co-chaired by both public and private sector leaders. Now, DHS and the Attorney General's office are working together as we speak to staff the board and ensure that it has an appropriate interdisciplinary composition to investigate significant cyber incidents. A lot of that is supposed to be wrapped up By the end of June, at the time we're recording this, we don't have that final public report in hand in terms of the board's scope and responsibilities and structure. So that's being worked on. But it's important to note that regardless of how this gets fleshed out, this is not the ultimate National Cybersecurity Safety Board. It's not an independent agency in the guise of the NTSB, though this is certainly the Cyber Safety Review Board, an important step in that direction. Now, before I turn things over to Chris here in just a moment, there are a number of important, challenges as well as opportunities to keep in mind as we think about and move toward the creation and fits and starts of this National Cybersecurity Safety Board. And again, many of these are going to be highlighted in much greater detail in that forthcoming Belfer Center report. First, it's important to note the scope. What types of cyber attacks should be investigated? How many people should be impacted? Should it be only on critical infrastructure? We know how broad that is. Maybe just particular critical infrastructure sectors? Should it involve, trade secrets or perhaps novel cyber attacks using some number of zero-day exploits? That scope question is critical. In the second half of 2018 alone, there were more than 40,000 breaches reported under the GDPR scheme in the EU. It's impossible to investigate all of these attacks under a type of National Cybersecurity Safety Board. So that scoping question is an incredibly important and difficult one. In the Belfer Center report, we settled on a 10 million people or 40 million in losses threshold, but again, open for debate. Workforce is another important one. As many of you are aware, there's a 0% unemployment rate in cybersecurity, according to many experts. So finding the right folks, ensuring it's an appropriate mix of expertise to staff not only the review board, but the interdisciplinary teams, that are actually going to be conducting these reviews is absolutely vital and incredibly difficult. There could be industry resistance that we'll run into, as we've seen in the tech sector and otherwise. There's been a lot of pushback for many years now against cybersecurity regulations. It looks like that logjam might be starting to break, at least here and there. But still, it's important to note that there are some elements of industry, including insurance, that could be supportive of this. There's also a large number of practical considerations to keep in mind, including with regards to sharing confidential information, personal health information between these interdisciplinary review teams, between the various stakeholders in play here. That is certainly easier said than done, as well as defining appropriate terminology. Should it be based around risk management, for example, the way the NIST cybersecurity framework is, and balancing a need to get reports out quickly, given the huge stakes oftentimes in the aftermath of these breaches. Think about Colonial Pipeline as a case in point, while ensuring that there's a comprehensive investigation being done. So there's a need for this slow, careful approach to investigations. But at the same time, in this executive order that we just saw from the Biden administration, the requirement is 90 days to submit these reviews. So that's another really difficult balancing act that we're going to have to see play out in practice. And then I think we can learn from the NTSB context. Again, Chris is going to turn to in just a moment. My last quick point first, though, is that this is just one of several much larger and more complicated reforms that we think are needed in this space, including the establishment of a full-bore National Cybersecurity Safety Board, or as we see here, a major cyber incident investigation board that would have the powers we see in the NTSB context, including the power to subpoena when needed. This Bureau of Cyber Statistics that's been talked about a lot, completely think and agree that that is also a vital component of these reforms that are required to get a much better picture for the types of threats that are happening, what trends that we're seeing in particular, as well as a cyber safety reporting system. That's incredibly important for any near misses. Perhaps they weren't actually breached in terms of these organizations, but if it was close, if other organizations are vulnerable, then we need to get the word out about that too. So a piece of the puzzle, but we think an important piece. As this gets stood up, because these are very early days, we think it's incredibly vital to learn lessons from the NTSB. So that's why I could not be more excited to turn this now over to former Chairman Chris Hart to dig into this context for us. So without further ado, Chris, over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Scott. That was a good foundation for what I'm about to talk about is how applicable is the NTSB framework to this context, because in some respects it's very applicable, in some respects not necessarily, so one size doesn't necessarily fit all. So the the agency was created to investigate transportation accidents in all modes and determine what caused accidents, and the output of the investigation is recommendations. So the NTSB is not a regulatory agency. It can't require anything. What it does is it makes recommendations, and it makes those recommendations without a cost benefit bias. So the idea is, if this were a perfect safety world, what would you recommend to do to improve the safety without looking at the cost benefit analysis? And that's an important aspect of the NTSB, is that the regulators have to look at the cost benefit analysis, but what they want from us would be what I would call the pure safety advice. So we investigate individual accidents. We also investigate trends. If something is trending in the wrong direction, we investigate those and make recommendations to try to correct those trends. A lot of people say, well, if all we do is recommend, then can people do people just ignore what we send them? They get letters from the NTSB, file 13. No, that doesn't happen. 80% of the time, people do what we recommend, and that's because the recommendations are so good that what you never want to happen is to be in front of the judge explaining why you didn't do a recommendation and why that recommendation caused a crash that now has you in front of the judge. That is our source of impetus, is if people don't want to be in front of the judge explaining why they didn't do one of our recommendations, they better do it. So more than 80% of the time, even though they don't have to, they do. Let me just mention as a final on this is that we are also an accredited representative for accidents outside the US. And I mention that because the Cybersecurity Board is obviously going to have to be an international, work with the international cyber community big time, because ideally you want harmonization and you want cooperation, because to really stop it in totality, you need to have collaborated effort amongst all the international members and not just one at a time doing this, that, and the other. They need to be working together in a collaborated sense. Next slide, please, Scott. So the reason they make it independent is because in most industries, if it's a regulated industry, and that's a big question here because this is not yet a regulated industry, but I predict that someday it will be. But in most regulated industries, when something goes wrong, the regulator is the investigator. The problem with that is oftentimes the regulator's actions or inactions are links in the chain to the accident. So if that's the case, then is the regulator's report going to mention the regulator's actions or inactions? Probably not. But when we do it as an independent investigator, we definitely mention what the regulator did or didn't do. And in fact, in every industry we deal with, in every one of the transportation modes, the regulator has received more recommendations than any other single entity in that mode of transportation. So that's the point of having an independent investigation, so that you get the totality of the picture, not just one that's biased by the regulator's viewpoint. Next slide, please. So we started as separate investigators in various different modes. So the aviation accidents have been investigated for almost since aviation began, but most of that was under the Department of Commerce. Other modes were investigated in other ways. So back in 1967, they created a Department of Transportation, which brought all of the modes under one roof for the purposes of safety regulation. And when they did that, they created the NTSB to investigate all of those accidents in all of those modes and to report those accidents to the public and to DOT. But they quickly realized, this is kind of strange, because if NTSB recommendations go to their boss, DOT, that's pretty awkward. So that's why they realized that's not going to work. Let's make the NTSB totally independent. So that's what it is today. So since 1974, it has been independent. So we didn't have that awkwardness of sending recommendations to our own, quote, boss, because now we don't have a boss. We just are an independent agency. Next one, please. So why, how do they make us independent? Well, there are several steps. You'll find that we are very unique. There's only one other independent agency in the US, and that's the Chemical Safety Board, and they have a lot of these features as well. So for example, they want party balance. So the president nominates each member and the Congress confirms those members. So there are 5 members and only 3 of those 5 can be of the president's party. So that's to create some party balance, so it's not a Democratic thing or a Republican thing. They insulate us from a lot of the political forces by giving us fixed terms instead of having us serve at the pleasure of the president. Because most political appointees serve at the pleasure of the president. And what that means in real world terms is if they do something politically unpopular, they're probably out. And we've seen that many times. The point of this is that if an investigation is going along and it's starting to look like it's disfavoring the operator or the manufacturer or the labor union or whoever, and they get upset with that appearance that it's not looking good for them, they can't go to the president and say, if you don't get rid of this guy who's starting to blame me for this, I'm going to ask you to throw him out. Well, they can't throw me out because I'm there for a fixed term. And that's the point of creating that independence, because the ultimate idea is you want our recommendations to be based on the facts and the evidence and not based on political lobbying. Knowledge requirement is very, very rare for political appointees. You could be the head of the Department of Labor and not know how to spell labor. But in our case, the law requires that 3 of the 5 members have some relevant background or experience. So there are lots of things in our law that have made us independent. And again, the purpose of that is to help ensure that what we come up with in terms of our cause determinations and recommendations are based on the facts and not influenced by lobbying or, smoke-filled backroom dealing under the table. Next slide, please. So the impetus for that is actually very simple, because in many countries, the only thing they investigate is airplane accidents. And that's because there's a large percentage of the public that's afraid of flying. So that's the case in the US as well. And not only that, let me put a footnote on that, and that is most federal legislators fly a lot between home and DC. And they're the ones who make the law. So of course they're going to have things that make that law very strong. So that's part of the reason why the NTSB is so unusual. And the reason I mention this is because the Chemical Safety Board doesn't have this level of political support. Scott mentioned, how will there be any resistance against a cyber board? And that's very possible because they don't have these kinds of incentives about the public being so interested in what we do as the NTSB does. So stay tuned on whether the NTSB model in that respect can be followed by the Cybersecurity Board. We will see. Next one, please. So separation from litigation is also important because we don't want our investigators to be worried, wow, if this came out, that company would be out of business. So we don't want them to be concerned about the other impacts. We just want them to look at the safety. So the way they did that was that our reports are public, but they are not admissible in litigation. And the factual part of the investigation is what involves everybody, the parties that are involved. So if it's a big airplane accident, it would include the airline, the manufacturers, the pilots, the mechanics, the airport, the regulator, everybody who has a dog in this fight who's involved in that accident in any way. So we need them for technical support, because if we saw a piece of metal out in the field, we would have no idea what that piece of metal is, but the manufacturer could tell us exactly what it is. And so we need them for that technical support. Once we get past the factual portion and get to the analytical portion, then it's only the NTSB, because we don't want the analytical portion to be unduly biased by any of the parties. So we invite the parties to submit their own analysis if they want, but the real analysis that counts is the one that we do, and we do that by ourselves. So it's a very collaborative process during the fact-finding phase, but it's not collaborative at all. It's just the NTSB during the analytical phase. Likewise, we want to protect our investigators from being in court all the time, so we allow only one deposition of our investigators, and that can only go to the facts. It can't go to their analysis or opinions. And now that with the internet, with all of our facts out on the internet, depositions are less likely because they're already getting the facts from the internet. The cockpit voice recorder is protected, and that's not public because we don't want the last 30 seconds of "I love you, mom," and this, that, and the other. We redact the non-pertinent part before we release it to the public, but that is never made public, just the parts that are pertinent to the accident. Next one, please. So here's the difference between what we do and cyber attacks. Almost all of our accidents are caused by inadvertent error. It's rare that we have intentional wrongdoing. When we do have intentional wrongdoing, we go to the FBI. So 9/11, that was intentional. They flew into the building on purpose. That was intentional. We go to the FBI. But the objective of our investigations is not to blame anyone, but to propose improvements to prevent these things from happening again, because the assumption is, as with cybersecurity, the people are trying to do the right thing and under sometimes difficult circumstances. And if they do the wrong thing, despite their efforts to do the right thing, then it's time to look at the difficult circumstances and not just focus on the person. And that's why we're looking at not blame, but try to propose improvements to prevent recurrences. Our investigations, as I say, are very collaborative because nobody wants an airplane to crash. And again, that's a question in cyber. Will we be able to say that? Well, I don't know. Maybe so, maybe not. So we'll have to see if that piece of the picture is transferable. So the outcome of our investigations, as I say, is recommendations to whoever can take the necessary action to fix it. And our investigations are very transparent, starting from the very first day when the members are on scene in front of the smoke-filled hole. We're on scene talking on the television about what we have found thus far that we can confirm as confirmed facts. So we want to be very transparent, and the purpose of the transparency is so that the public will know without any doubt that what we concluded was based on the facts and not based on political lobbying. So as I say, when we find evidence of criminal activity, we go to the FBI, they take over, and we provide technical support to the FBI. Next slide, please. So here's the difference, is that cyber attacks aren't because of inadvertent error, they are intentional. So now we've got an interesting mix here because it combines the need to find the perpetrator, as criminal investigations want to do, along with the need to improve the defenses so that there will be fewer mishaps in the future, as the NTSB tries to do. So that's going to be a challenge to mix those functions together. And one of the reasons it's going to be a challenge is because transparency is crucial to the NTSB, as I mentioned, so that the public will have confidence that what we are doing is based on the facts. But transparency is what you do not normally want in criminal proceedings, and you certainly don't want it here, when that transparency could provide information to potential hackers about, oh wow, now there's a thought, I could use that aspect of that system and use that to my advantage to hack that system. So the question is going to be, how do we do this process that involves both the need to find the perpetrator and the need to improve defenses to prevent future events? How do we combine those processes? That's going to be part of the challenge that we'll have to learn from, because there is no precedent for that for an agency that does both. Next one, please. So people ask me all the time, what about an NTSB in healthcare? To look at all of the, who knows what the number is, 200,000 deaths every year in US hospitals due to medical mistakes. What about the 2008 financial mess up? So a lot of people came up with solutions immediately. They were throwing solutions all over the place, but nobody had really identified the problem. That's what the NTSB would do, is identify the problem, so you have an idea what the target is for your solutions. So when people ask me about NTSB and other applications like this one, like cyber, I say, here's my two recommendations. One is, if it's a rare mishap that even surprised the experts, wow, how did that happen? Then I would recommend an exhaustive NTSB type investigation that looks at that event to find out what caused that event and what can be done to prevent that type of event from happening again. So those investigations are very thorough, and that's why our investigations usually take at least a year. For things that happen almost every day, like in healthcare, wrong site surgery, it basically is still happening every day. So when they happen every day, that usually suggests that there are some systemic issues, not issues related to that specific event, but systemic issues. And I have to think that the cyber world is going to have both of these types. They're going to have the ones that occur frequently, as Scott mentioned, and they are also going to have the really rare ones that confounded even the experts. So when it's the ones that are rare, that's why I would put the NTSB after that. But for the ones that are frequent, the aviation system has developed a trend situation analysis technique called CAS, Commercial Aviation Safety Team. And they look at the trends, because usually, as I say, that suggests systemic issues that need to be fixed rather than issues related to a specific event. So I suspect that the cyber board is going to have to be able to do both of those. Next slide, please. So if anybody asks me what would I tell the Biden administration, I would tell them just what I said. If the problem occurs a lot, that reflects systemic shortcomings and suggests that you investigate the trend rather than individual events. And that's the Commercial Aviation Safety Team. But if the problems are rare and surprise even the experts, that's when you really need an in-depth investigation to try to prevent that from happening again. Next slide, please. So one size does not fit all, but I think there's lots that can be learned from the NTSB processes, and one of them is active participation by the parties for technical support, because I can guarantee you the cyber board will need that technical support to try to figure out the details of what happened. So some of that will be transferable to look at cyber, but some of it won't. And the part about combining the desire to find the perpetrator with the desire to prevent things from happening again, that's going to be an interesting mix that has no precedent. So we'll be glad to do what we can as in our role as NTSB to see if we can help that mixture work, because this is going to be a new one. So thanks again for the opportunity to come and participate in this. I look forward to participating more as this procedure moves along, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to work with Scott and go as far as we can into this to prevent these things from happening again, because it's really scary when you read about what's vulnerable and how many things are vulnerable that could be messed with. When we saw the one with the pipeline, that was scary enough. There was also the one with the municipal water system and actually poisoning the water. And there's so many ways that the electric grid is truly vulnerable. There's so many ways that this is so important. So I'm glad to be able to play a part in it. So Scott, thank you for including me.
No, and thank you so much, Chris, for those incredibly helpful insights built on a exemplary career in this space. And just a final note before we have to conclude here in the interest of time is, as Chris said, there's so many important differences between aviation and cybersecurity. In aviation, there's a single regulator oftentimes in many countries. There's an international organization, ICAO, right, that can help coordinate these regulations. It's a lot harder, for example, hide a airline disaster than a cyber attack. So there's a number of differences. But one key point we wanted to end with is the fact that one reason the NTSB has been successful as it is, and mercifully has helped to bend the curve in terms of safety for mass transit, is because of this global network of NTSB-like organizations. So this is called out in the executive order, and we just wanted to put it out there as well that if we're really going to see the benefits from this come to the fore, we need to build on the foundations that are already there, including the dozens of countries around the world that are using risk management frameworks like NIST, or even more omnibus approaches like GDPR, to build this consensus around cybersecurity and risk management, and the utility of these types of investigatory review boards for the situations in which they make sense. As Chris said, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach, but by having this global system in place, we might not be able to make cyber attacks as rare as airline disasters, but I think we can certainly make them hopefully a more manageable problem. So thank you so much again for this opportunity, and we welcome any questions you might have.